let's go straight over then to my first guest. Really good to have her on board as always. Talks international editor Isabel Oakeshott. Welcome, Isabel.
Hi, we've got so much to get through, haven't we? Because, I mean, I'm sure all our listeners are absolutely fuming about the immigration stats, and we're going to do a good long hit on that.
Definitely.
But first of all, you said that we're going to talk about the vaccine.
Yeah, well,
let's
put it in context. You've released on your Substack channel. It's called Inside the Right. Have a look at it, everyone. It's well worth looking at. Now, this is the beginning of an exclusive series that you're writing about the inside story of how the government handled the pandemic, particularly with reference to the COVID vaccine. Now, I've always said that my problem with the COVID vaccine, I'm not an anti-vaxxer or anything, but I just never thought it worked. Now, reading your excellent article, your excellent piece today, I think that a lot of my fears and suspicions are kind of confirmed. So I think the question is this. As the government, Matt Hancock, the then health secretary, frantically tried to roll out, particularly the AstraZeneca jab, I mean, what was primarily in their minds? Was it public health? Or was it just politics? Was it a desperation to say to the British population, we've done something? As Boris kept saying, we've got a game changer here. This is a world beater. Behind the scenes, you reveal that there were frenzied discussions between Matt Hancock, Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty, and other luminaries, Simon Case even, the Cabinet Secretary, got involved, about just whether or not this vaccine actually worked. And Matt Hancock in particular was terrified that if Boris saw the somewhat damning verdict by the Joint Vaccine Committee for Immunisation, which said, we're not sure if it works. It has a trivial effect. It was all vague and nebulous. And Matt Hancock, who wanted to own the situation and promote his own career, was terrified that Boris Johnson would look at this verdict by the Joint Vaccine Committee and go, this is a waste of time, let's forget it. It's an extraordinary story that we didn't know was going on while we were all sort of suffering lockdowns and trying to deal with the pandemic.
That's right. Essentially, the vaccine was a multi-billion-pound punt by the government, and they bet the house on this and more. From a very early stage in the pandemic, before we knew how serious this virus was going to be for the majority of the population, the government was quite fixated on procuring a vaccine. And many people will think, well, that's all well and good. You know, at that stage in the very early days, it did look as if this virus might be terribly, terribly dangerous to more than just the very elderly and vulnerable. And it was quite right that the government, whose job it is to protect us, went all out to get going with research and trying to find some sort of treatment. The issue is that as time went on, it became increasingly apparent that COVID was not a lethal virus for the vast majority of people. But by then, the government had already basically placed its bets, and they certainly weren't going to be backtracking. They were going to double down. And the more money they put in it, the more contracts they signed, the harder it became to do anything other than lean very heavily into this vaccine. And it was seen by ministers and presented by ministers as the way out of lockdown. So everything was riding on this jab. And, you know, people will remember the excitement that they built up, you know, as to the first vaccines being rolled out and so on. And this was a great British triumph. What I've revealed and what I'm going to be revealing more of in the coming weeks is the conversations that were going on behind the scenes about how good the vaccine actually was, how safe it was, and about how to treat any questions, awkward questions, difficult, awkward squads and experts who are saying, you know, maybe actually we don't need to be giving this to everybody, and reminding ministers that in the early days, they were telling us all that it was only for adults And then by the end of the pandemic, they were beginning to say, well, actually, we should give it to older school children. There was never, in my view, any case for that. And many of our listeners may not really realise that the AstraZeneca jab was quietly dropped by the NHS. Why? Because it was no longer needed, A, and B, because there are real concerns over side effects. All jabs have side effects, of course they do, but truth of the matter is that a significant number of people did suffer serious harm as a result of being put under tremendous pressure, tremendous emotional blackmail, I would go as far to say, to have a jab that, frankly, the vast majority of people did not actually need.
I think we talked about this. I talked about it with Ben Habib last night, actually, man of the moment. And we were told, of course, when we were first given Boris, in full booster mode, wasn't he? Game changer, world beater, Britain leads the way. And we were told, get the jab and then you won't get COVID. Oh, wait a minute. It won't stop you getting COVID. Oh, well, get the jab anyway, because then you won't give it to your granny. You won't be able to pass it on. You won't pass it on to vulnerable people. Oh, wait a minute. It won't stop you passing it on to vulnerable people. Oh, well, it'll stop you dying. Well, I've always thought that was a very difficult thing to quantify. It'll stop you going to hospital or dying. I think they were grasping at straws by then. And what you reveal, sometimes in the WhatsApps that you have, which are WhatsApps between Matt Hancock, senior members of government, the medical officers, etc., that they were very worried that it didn't really work. The backdrop of this is, and the other aspect to point out, of course, is they were worried about the harm it might do. It seems to me that their best shot, that what they were hoping was, at least it might not do anyone any harm. The reason I point that out is Wes Streeting, the current Health Secretary, is thinking of setting up a whole new compensation scheme because the existing vaccine damage payment scheme is currently overwhelmed. There are 15,000, more than 15,000 claims against it. According to figures, we've got 63 deaths linked to the vaccine in England, 9 deaths in Scotland, 27 deaths in Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth. This isn't to say that that makes it a very, very dangerous jab. As you said, statistically, the bad effects of this were pretty damn small, but they were there, and the government was terrified at one point that, in fact, this jab might be harming people. So the story that was going on in Westminster behind closed doors that we didn't know, I think would have alarmed us at the time, wouldn't it?
What is truly shocking is that there was such a media blackout at the time on any reporting of anyone suffering serious harm, still less anyone actually dying. And the ugly truth of the matter is that a number of people did die as a result of this jab. And that's not just me or any anti-vax campaigners or nutters saying that. That is the actual conclusion and verdict at coroner's courts. And there was no reporting of that at the time. We simply were not allowed to do so. The government exerted enormous pressure on media bosses, on editors, not to run any story that might undermine public confidence in the vaccine programme. And personally, I think that was wrong. Now, there will be people that take a different view and say, well, for the greater good, it's right that nobody was too rattled because more people's lives may have been saved and a small number of people, unfortunately, just had to pay the price. I think that argument only works if there was an overwhelming need for the vast majority of people to have this vaccine. But I don't think that there really is any argument to be made now that there was that need. And it's really shocking that at the time, anybody who tried to raise these points was so vilified. I mean, I got sick of having to say at the time that I'd had the vaccine. I didn't really want the vaccine, honestly. I really kind of regret having it, but it made it easier to criticize from the point of view of saying, well, actually, I've had it. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. You know, I do think vaccines have made an amazing difference to public health. Of course they have. But just think of the way that people were pressured. You know, it was awful.
Yeah.
And people may have forgotten that there was a period of time when those working in the NHS and social care were actually told that they would lose their jobs if they didn't have this jab, and they didn't need it. And that was just downright wrong and quite unethical, I think.
Care home workers who refused the jab did lose their jobs. I remember that time very well. I always used to sit here on Talk Radio as it was then, and just say, look, as far as I'm concerned, if you want to take the jab, if you want the vaccine, that's your choice. Good for you. If you don't want to, that's your choice. But the people who said, I don't want to take this vaccine, were vilified. They were absolutely demonised. They were turned into enemies of society. That was what was so wrong, and the government encouraged that. And I remember, I'll give you an example of talking to a doctor, you know, about this vaccine, and it was with a view to what we're discussing about its efficacy. And I said to him, well, wait a minute, you know, you're telling me it doesn't stop me getting it, it doesn't stop me passing it on. So what exactly is the point of it? And he turned around and said, are you some sort of anti-vaxxer? I mean, that was the government's response. It didn't even make logical sense, and yet that kind of scepticism, which, by the way, people like you and me, Isabel, that's what we're paid to be. Journalists are sceptics. We were slammed down. How dare you? You're an anti-vaxxer. No, I'm not. I'm just asking very legitimate questions about a vaccine that, to me, that doesn't seem to work.
Well, it's taken far too many years for the truth to come out. And actually now there has been, in a sense, a watershed moment. And you can look at the appointments that Donald Trump has made to his new administration. And he has put one very eminent expert, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, into a very senior position in his incoming administration. Jay Bhattacharya was one of the primary people that was basically putting a different solution, a different approach to the pandemic than lockdown. People might remember the Barrington Declaration. He is one of the experts that was utterly smeared and vilified, and now he's going to be in a position of great influence, along with RFK Jr., another vaccine skeptic. I think that's a perfectly fair way to describe him when it comes to the COVID vaccine. So slowly, the truth is coming out, and organisations like the BBC that did not touch these stories a few years ago are now reporting more openly. I think it is a great shame that they weren't brave enough to do so at the time. I do understand they felt they had a responsibility, but sometimes people listen too seriously to what ministers tell them. Yeah,
I mean, the fact is, as you point out in your brilliant article, people died. Yeah, some people died very quickly after the COVID jab. Others got very sick. Others got lifelong conditions. Very important to stress, these are extremely small numbers. But if you brought that up, oh my God, you were silenced. It was a pretty sinister time, and you're right. The sunlight of transparency is casting a whole new picture of what happened then, and so does your brilliant series, Isabel. But as I'll just leave this hanging in the air, that West Streeting is considering, lest you think that Isabel and I are talking about some story that's over and dead. West Streeting is considering setting up a new compensation scheme for the vaccine jab, for the COVID jab, because the current vaccine damage payment scheme is overwhelmed and cannot handle the current high volume of claims, which latest figures show is over more than 15,000. So this is a very serious situation. Once again, Isabel, just before we move on, tell everyone where they can read your piece.
Yeah, so this is on my Substack. It's called Inside the Right, and you should be able to also find links to it on my X social media platform. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Isabel.